I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of Movie Star Magic. And this week we're going to be looking at the career of Jackie Chan, one of the most charismatic movie stars of all time, who dominated the sort of late 90s, early 2000s in Hollywood. But that's actually the later part of his career. He's a really fascinating movie star because he's had a huge career in Hong Kong and then China, and as well in Hollywood and across the world. He is one of the very first true global movie stars. So I knew I had to dig deep into his career and find out what made Jackie Chan so great. And that's the ultimate goal of this series. Essentially, every week I break down the career of a different actor. I start off by giving a sort of long history of their career arc, how it's changed, how it's evolved, in sort of breaking down their career in 3 different chapters and giving a defining role within those chapters. So that just allows us to talk about the overall sort of career trajectory of an actor. And then at the end of the video, I try to define their defining feature. I try to figure out what is that one thing that makes them a movie star. What is their movie star magic? And starting off with chapter 1. With Jackie Chan, I'm going to call this chapter The Young Buck. And I mentioned it at the top of the video, but this is a really interesting career from Jackie, because this first chapter and even the second chapter are a lot of his Hong Kong films. Before the Rush Hours, before the Shanghai Noon, before a lot of people, including myself, really sort of were first introduced to him, he's had a long history of making really terrific films. So in this first period, I call this period The Young Buck, because Jackie starts his career very early on in his 20s and becomes successful in that period. The sort of big year for him was 1978, which saw the release of Drunken, which was a sort of big breakout. It was a big success at the box office. Is sort of a classic martial arts kind of a film, but with a little bit of a twist, because Jackie is the sort of young up-and-comer, even within the plot of the movie. And then Wong Fei-hung was the sort of counterpoint to him, who was for the most part a dramatic actor who was playing comedic for the very first time. So that was sort of the interesting draw of the movie. And then when a lot of people saw the movie, they saw Jackie and the sort of silliness and the playfulness that he has, of course with the excellent martial arts and stunts that he was able to do, but also combined, I think, with his charisma. Pretty early on, we see what he has to bring, what he brings through a lot of his movies, even in sort of early roles in his 20s here with Drunken, which was sort of the big successor for him, because he wasn't maybe necessarily even the star of the movie, but was positioned well within the story of the movie and within the success of the movie to be the sort of next breakout role. We see this in movies like Crimson Tide or The Color of Money, where you have an older actor and a younger actor, and it always gives the younger actor a good chance to sort of go toe-to-toe with a legacy actor while also sort of gaining their approval. And this was sort of a similar part, at least within martial arts films in Hong Kong cinema at the time. But during this period, he tries his first step at Hollywood in Cannonball Run in sort of the early 80s there, but sort of largely unsuccessful. They didn't really know how to use him. It's still, America in the 80s, so who knows if there's a lot of parts for him necessarily. So he tries to do a little bit of a stint in America. That doesn't work, trying to leverage his success in martial arts films. But in this sort of period, in the 70s and into the early 80s, we see him really sort of stick to this martial arts genre, and that's what he's best known for, because of course he's so great at the stunts and at the fighting. So much of it he does himself. So that's what he sort of excelled in early on. But then talking about the defining role of this period, it has to be Drunken Master, a very sort of traditional Cantonese cinema in terms of the stereotypical over-the-top characters, and then of course the hero who has to sort of learn his ways and gets into the sort of hijinks. It's a classic Jackie Chan movie in the sense that it's very playful in its energy. Nothing is ever too serious, even though there's people trying to kill him and there's an assassin out for him. Because of course added into the plot of the movie being this guy who has to drink more to get better, and then sort of his montage training sequence because he's sort of out of hand. But even in the sort of early opening scene of the movie, in which we see Jackie, he comes to life so early on in the movie, because on one hand it's a great movie for Jackie and for his sensibilities, and Jackie excels within the movie because of what he's able to do. It's sort of a great pairing, because early on we see that he's sort of overly confident and a little bit, needs to be humbled a bit, but he's of course very talented as well. So it allows him to be in these sort of dramatic comedic situations while also allowing him to fight his way out, just so to show his athleticism, but also to show his comedic chops. And because the conceit in the movie is sort of silly and playful, I think that really adds to Jackie Chan's strengths, and he really excels within the movie as well because he's able to sort of match that tone really perfectly. So then in chapter 2, I'm going to call this the Supercop chapter, in which after sort of failed stint in Hollywood, where they wasn't really sure what to do with him, he has to sort of chart his own path, which makes him such a unique and interesting movie star. And he is sort of finds solace in the second half of his career by playing cops that he sort of was defined early on by doing the martial arts movie, and even when he went to Hollywood, that was sort of the mold for him, like a Bruce Lee type. But he's very much a very different performer than that, and therefore succeeded, I think, when he started to play cops or Secret Service, government-associated kind of agents, whether it be in the Police Story franchise, which leads to Supercop, which leads to its own sort of franchise, or Armor of God series, Operation Condor. Really from the sort of mid-80s with Police Story into the mid-90s, Jackie sort of rides the wave, as well as the sort of John Woo Hong Kong action movies of the sort of late 90s, which inspired so many of these sort of American action movies of the 90s. He was definitely a part of that and helped create that, even as early on with the sort of 80s Police Story movies, which the first one he directed. So building himself as a movie star, going away from just the martial arts genre and into the sort of more four-quadrant movie star sort of factor, being continued sustained success, so he could do the martial arts stuff, but he can also do the cop stuff as well, and he can also direct, so he's sort of building his skill set there. And then if you're in the know, these sort of, particularly more so in the 90s, these sort of Hong Kong movies that star Jackie Chan, even before Rush Hour, were getting distributed by Warner Brothers and New Line Cinema, and were doing well in the States. Movies like Rumble in the Bronx and Mr. Nice Guy. Before we actually get into the English movies, sort of true Hollywood movies, we get sort of an early test market early on into Hollywood, which is sort of the later part of this chapter, but definitely in the early parts, you're refining his skills, and developing a franchise for himself. In this case, the case of Police Story or Armor of God. So when we're talking about the defining role of this period, I went with Supercop, which was actually a movie I saw for the very first time in preparation for this video, and my initial thought was, why hasn't the past generation told me about this? Why isn't this sort of seminal action classic the way it really should be? I think this is on the level of a Mad Max or a Die Hard or a Lethal Weapons. We are sort of educated on them pretty early on as classic action movies, but this one I think was sort of fell to the wayside, despite being, I thought, a really sort of modern feeling and terrific stunt-based action movie, reminding me a lot of Mission Impossible, very similar to Tom Cruise. Jackie does a lot of stunts, even more so than Tom Cruise, and can do the martial arts as well, so can have that sort of element of relatability to it, but of course has these great action sequences. And I almost went with Police Story with this one, which may be a slightly better movie, but I think Supercop is a situation where they just had more money and therefore had bigger and bolder stunts, and I also think introduces Jackie as a really interesting buddy cop figure, that he's not just great on his own, that he can really be great, and I think he's almost at his best when he's paired up with somebody. So on one hand, you have this sort of building upon the Police Story sequels, with his wife May and the inspector, who they have their sort of own unique relationships with, which is very sort of fleshed out and developed and has that sort of history from the other Police Story movies. But this movie introduces Michelle Yeoh as sort of undercover agent buddy, and they have great dynamics together. And so much of the success of the Police Story franchise and of Jackie's movie star is putting him in these sort of awkward situations where he has to get out of it somehow, whether that be physically, some sort of weird jostling or fight or physical maneuver, or sort of a battle of wits, comedy, kind of dramatic irony situations, instances with May and whatnot. But that's why Supercop, I think, is so interesting, because the conceit of the movie is, of course, them being undercover, Michelle Yeoh and Jackie Chan. So we have so many of these instances of these comedy of manners, of this sort of dramatic irony, where we know as the audience, we're with Jackie, we know that he can't blow his cover, but of course we see him trying to get away with it and introduce his sister undercover in Michelle Yeoh, so there's all that sort of funniness there, and they do have so many sort of sequences back to back to back which are very funny, like Michelle Yeoh having a bomb shot to her chest, but also genuinely exciting and thrilling with terrifically staged action sequences that utilize sort of big budget explosions of the Michael Bay, but then also utilize these sort of martial arts talents you have and physical giftedness that you have from a performer like Jackie Chan. So that was Supercop. Now going to chapter 3, I'm going to title this one The American Journey. So for a lot of people, we were introduced to Jackie Chan in this American journey. But despite that, if you look at his career as a whole, at least where it is right now, that's definitely a third chapter. That's definitely the sort of later chapter of his career, because he mastered all these sort of different international markets before he actually came to Hollywood. He was already a huge movie star in Hong Kong. So like I said, Jackie sort of being slowly introduced to American audiences, trying again and once again in Hollywood, but still it's these, Chinese films that are being shown and distributed by Warner Brothers and New Line, but they're still in a different language. They're still oftentimes dubbed in English. So it's not until '98 with Rush Hour where we see Jackie speaking English, and it's a New Line production, and it's a true Hollywood sort of American production, pairing him with Chris Tucker, utilizing his sort of great buddy cop duo dynamism that he's so great at, and of course that movie is a huge success, spawns 2 other sequels, and then they sort of continue with that sort of buddy cop energy by pairing with Owen Wilson in the Shanghai Noon series, the Shanghai Noon and Shanghai Nights, and that's sort of the first part of his American journey. I think in the second part there, we have the sort of younger kid journey, so we have the Spy Next Door and the Karate Kid, a little bit more family friendly, his stunt in America, but then after that, he starts to go back to making Chinese movies. He very rarely shows up in an American Hollywood movie. That's not to say he won't do that, but that right now is just where he is sort of focusing on doing action movies, but mostly for the Chinese market. And just because, I don't see those movies, I don't have a full grasp on them. So that's why I still wanted to call this last chapter here The American Journey, particularly the sort of period from 98 to 2008 to 2010 with The Karate Kid. But when we're talking about the sort of defining role of this period, you gotta go with Rush Hour. That's the clearest one here, playing perfectly off of Chris Tucker and his sort of crazy antics. Jackie is the sort of straight man of the movie, the sort of serious guy, but of course he's also very funny in his own right too, and that's sort of the secret mix of a buddy cop movie, is that, David Spade is a straight man and Tommy Boy, but David Spade's an excellent comedian, so of course he's going to be funny, and I think the same works here with Jackie. Of course, it works well as a buddy cop movie because of their dynamic, it's a classic sort of structure, but then the added element on top of this being that Jackie can do so many of these great stunts, so we see a lot of great stunts within the movie, which harken back to some of his successful Hong Kong movies. So we allow that sort of humor, race clash back and forth. That not all of it has totally aged well, but I still think a lot of people recognize, including myself, it is very funny in many instances. So we have this sort of actual genuine comedy, but we also have some actual legitimate interesting action that Jackie's able to bring because of his sort of stunt background and success and proficiency in martial arts. So Rush Hour, great duo, very funny movie, but also sort of that added element because you have some interesting action sequences too. It's just a perfect pairing, and buddy cop movies, when you had a perfect pairing, you'd watch them do anything, and I definitely think Jackie Chan and Chris Tucker was sort of hitting a gold mine. Then talking about the defining feature of Jackie Chan, his movie star magic. The title of this video, I called him Jackie Chan the Comic Stuntman, because those are the sort of two things that I thought were sort of interesting about Jackie Chan as a movie star. The indelible features that he had. The fact that he can do the stunts. But a lot of people can do stunts. There are a lot of great sort of stuntmen who become leading actors who are kind of boring movie star leads, have no charisma, and you can do cool action stunts, and that's all right, but they don't have the other part. And then there's some people that just ghost on their charisma and have to get a stuntman. But Jackie's so great because he's able to do both. We talked about Wesley Snipes as the athlete, who was great at these sort of athletic stuff, but compare Wesley Snipes to someone like a Jackie Chan, there's no contest. Jackie's doing an incredible amount of stunts. He is known for his stunts. He's known for these sort of jaw-dropping feats of holding off the side of a bus with an umbrella, or riding motorcycles, or doing these sort of crazy instances, or even just in the martial arts movies. His skill is very interesting in Drunken Master and The Legend of the Drunken Master, of course, doing it into the 90s. For the rest of cinema, that will look cool. Seeing the main guy, you can see him actually doing that stuff for real, no CGI. That is just so impressive to the human eye. That will always be cool. And he's really great at that. So of course that has to be an element of it. But of course, Jackie's also interesting because he's great at comedy. He's got great comedic timing, and therefore what that does in combination with the sort of stuntman real life stunts is create these sort of ultimate, uber, relatable, but very charismatic main character. And that's why when he sticks with a franchise like Police Story, you just want to see him do Inspector Chan do, stuff over and over and over again. I can see a TV show with that because he's such a very likable character, because it's so perfectly attuned to Jackie's skill set, that being the sort of dual threat of making a character relatable. If you see an actual guy like Tom Cruise, hanging off the side of a plane in a Mission Impossible movie, it's sort of easy cheat code to make you go, wow, I kind of am connected to that main character. I actually see him doing that. That's an impressive feat. And therefore, because the actor's actually doing that, I believe more in the sort of story that they're telling in terms of the reality of the movie. So that grounds the movie and adds sort of a sense of relatability to the character. Not necessarily like, oh my god, that's just like me, but in a sense just that like he seems like a real person because he actually did those stunts. Therefore this is plausible, therefore this grounds the movie. So that really works into the relatability, that fact that Jackie can do those stunts. And then because he's very funny, he can sort of disarm people many times. He seems like a guy in peril many times. He seems like a regular person because he can make jokes at these sort of instances. We're always sort of fearful of Jackie's sort of case. He's not always a guy like I mentioned, like a Schwarzenegger, who is so physically domineering. He feels a little bit more like a dad or a likable guy that or just a regular cop that does extraordinary things. And because of that comedy, because of that stunt timing, we're able to have this deep sense of likability and relatability to Jackie's characters, which makes his movie star magic and his charisma just shoot through the roof. And the word that comes to mind when I think about Jackie as a movie star, it's playful. Whether it be the bloopers at the end of his movies, or just sort of his general attitude in terms of approaching movies. He makes movies feel like they're fun. He gives a sort of low stakes kind of approach to them. Even if they're getting shot at, it's almost like, oh, we gotta get out of this. There's a playfulness to it. There's always a sort of sense of fun to his movies, that he's having fun, that his characters will always make it out sometimes, that there's sort of intrigue and stakes, but it's very much sort of a theme park ride kind of movie, and Jackie sort of embodies that. So a huge international movie star, so much fun, very likable. His movie star persona for a lot of people, whether you know him as sort of the Karate Kid reboot guy, or the Rush Hour guy, or you knew his Hong Kong films before then. It was a pleasure to sort of go back and rewatch and watch for the first time a lot of his movies: Operation Condor, Crime Story, Police Story 2, 3, the ones that I sort of had missed. And it's just so obvious to me that Jackie Chan is such a clear and overwhelming movie star, because of that sort of deadly combination of being able to do those stunts, which adds the relatability, and then also his comedic timing. He truly is a singular sort of performer, and I know he's doing Chinese films right now, but man, I love to see Jackie come back. But that's about it. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below, let me know your thoughts on Jackie Chan as a movie star. That's about it. Until next time, stay tuned.